Lena Vasquez almost missed it. She was in the back room brewing coffee, the real kind she kept locked in her personal stores and rationed like medicine, when the monitoring system chimed its standard alert tone. A single chime, low priority, the sound it made when a routine automated transmission passed through the relay's scanning window. Dozens came in every hour. Navigational beacons from cargo ships, status pings from drone networks, the endless mechanical heartbeat of a civilized galaxy going about its business. Lena had been working relay stations for 19 years, and she had long since stopped jumping at single chimes. She carried her coffee back to the main console and settled into the worn chair that had molded itself to her shape over the course of her posting at Omega 9, a lonely waystation anchored to an asteroid in the sparse darkness between the Confederation's inner and outer territories. The station was small, barely large enough for one person to live and work comfortably, and it processed communications traffic that passed through its sector on the way to somewhere more important. Lena was there because someone had to be, and because she had volunteered, and because the alternatives had been worse. She glanced at the alert log. The signal was tagged as an uncorrelated transmission on a frequency she didn't immediately recognize. That was unusual but not unprecedented. The galaxy was full of legacy systems, ancient automated beacons that had been broadcasting for centuries on frequencies that modern equipment only detected as anomalous blips. She could have dismissed it. Protocol allowed her to dismiss it. A single uncorrelated signal on an unfamiliar frequency from a bearing that pointed toward empty space was, by any reasonable assessment, not worth investigating at 3 in the morning. But Lena had been sitting in this chair for 14 months, and the silence had gotten into her bones the way it always did, and she was not quite ready to go back to her bunk and stare at the ceiling for another 4 hours before her shift officially began. She opened the signal file. The first thing she noticed was that it was not a standard beacon pulse. Beacon pulses were simple, repetitive, informationally flat. This signal had structure. A carrier wave modulated with data packets arranged in a pattern that her analysis software couldn't match to any known protocol. She ran a frequency analysis and found that the carrier was operating at 2.37 gigahertz, a frequency that had not been used for civilian or military communications in the entire span of Lena's career or training. She cross-referenced it against the historical communications database stored in the relay's archives and got a partial match that made her set her coffee down very carefully. The frequency had been used by human military vessels approximately 15,000 years ago. Lena stared at the match percentage glowing on her screen. It was 61%, which was high enough to be significant and low enough to be misleading. Historical frequency data from 15 millennia ago was fragmentary at best, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and theoretical models rather than actual recordings. The match could be coincidental. It probably was coincidental. A random signal on a frequency that happened to partially resemble something from the deep past was not evidence of anything except the mathematical inevitability of partial matches in large datasets. But the signal had structure, and the structure was not random. She ran a protocol analysis on the data packets. The software tried to match the packet structure against every known communications standard in its database, which included protocols from every species in the Confederation and archived formats from every era of human spacefaring history that had been preserved. The search took 4 minutes and returned no matches. Lena leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. She was 53 years old, divorced twice, with a grown daughter on Terra Nova who communicated with her on a schedule that could most charitably be described as intermittent. She had taken the posting at Omega 9 because it paid well and because it was very far from the places and people that reminded her of the things she had failed at. She was not an adventurer. She was not a discoverer. She was a communications technician with a reliable pension plan and a coffee addiction, and she was not the person who should be sitting here at 3 in the morning looking at a signal that didn't make sense. But the signal was there, and it was structured, and it was on a frequency that hadn't been used in 15,000 years. She ran a bearing analysis to determine the signal's point of origin. The relay's directional array triangulated the source over the course of 11 minutes, cross-referencing the signal's arrival angle at multiple scanning windows to build a position estimate. The result poi entered to a region of space approximately 42 light-years from Omega 9, in a direction that the star charts identified as the Corridor of Echoes, a sparse region of interstellar space that contained no known stars, no colonies, no stations, and no documented reason for anything to be transmitting from it. Lena pulled up the star charts and examined the Corridor of Echoes. It was a void between two spiral arms, a region where stellar density dropped to near zero and the darkness between stars became absolute. Nothing was there. Nothing had ever been there according to every survey ever conducted. The region was too empty to be strategically useful, too distant to be economically viable, and too devoid of resources to be worth investigating. It was the kind of place that existed on star charts as a blank patch, a gap in the tapestry of the galaxy that nobody had ever needed to fill. And something in that void was broadcasting a structured signal on a 15,000-year-old military frequency. Lena picked up her coffee and took a long sip. Then she opened a new analysis window and began to work. The signal repeated every 47 seconds. Identical each time, no variation in content or timing, the mechanical repetition of an automated system that had been doing the same thing over and over again for a very long time. Lena recorded 6 complete cycles and compared them bit for bit. They were identical, which ruled out any kind of intelligent modulation and confirmed that this was a recorded message on a loop. Whatever had originally sent this signal was not actively transmitting. It was playing back a recording, the way a lighthouse's beam swept the horizon regardless of whether anyone was watching. She spent the next 3 hours trying to decode the data packets. The protocol was unlike anything in her databases, but it was clearly deliberate, with headers, checksums, and structural markers that indicated intelligent design. The problem was that the design was based on assumptions about data encoding that no longer matched any current standard. The packets used a base 12 numbering system, for example, which no known human civilization had employed for data transmission in at least 12,000 years. The character encoding was similarly archaic, using a symbol set that Lena eventually traced to a proto-linguistic matrix that predated the development of unified human script by several millennia. She was not a linguist or a cryptographer. She was a communications technician, trained to recognize and route signals, not to decode ones that had been designed before human writing systems had fully stabilized. But she was good at patterns. 19 years of monitoring communications traffic had given her an intuitive sense for the shape of information, the way data organized itself when it was carrying meaning rather than noise. And as she studied the packets, she began to see the outlines of something beneath the encoding. She couldn't read the content, but she could identify the structure. There were blocks of data that appeared to be navigational coordinates, encoded in a frame format that was recognizable despite the archaic numbering system. There were blocks that looked like status information, sequences of values that corresponded to standard shipboard system categories: power, life support, structural integrity. And there was a block at the beginning of each transmission cycle that was different from the rest, shorter and more densely packed, that Lena suspected was the message itself. The actual words that someone 15,000 years ago had wanted to be heard. She stared at that block of data and felt something shift in her chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with the coffee or the late hour. Someone had recorded this message. A person had sat at a communications station, on a ship that used base 12 encoding and proto-linguistic matrices, and had spoken words that had been encoded into this signal and broadcast into the void, and the signal had been traveling through space for 15,000 years and it had just reached her. She couldn't read it, but she knew what it was. It was a distress call. At 0630, Lena made a decision she would later question for the rest of her life. She did not file a routine report. She did not forward the signal to the Regional Communications Authority for cataloging and analysis. She composed a direct message to the only person she knew who might be able to help her understand what she was looking at. and she sent it on a priority channel that she was not technically authorized to use for personal communications. His name was Dr. Emil Soren, and he was a professor of xenoarchaeology at the University of Seoul. And he was also Lena's ex-husband from her first marriage, which had ended 26 years ago amid arguments about his obsessive work habits and her inability to compete with the dead civilizations that consumed his attention. They had no tea spoken in 4 years. The message was brief. She attached the signal data and wrote, "I need you to look at this. Don't show it to anyone else yet. I know I don't have the right to ask. Please." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and then she sat in the quiet of Omega 9 and listened to the signal repeat, 47 seconds apart, the same coded cry for help that had been echoing through the darkness for 15,000 years, and she waited. Emil replied 11 hours later. His response was characteristically terse, 3 sentences that contained no acknowledgement of the personal weight of her message and no reference to the years of silence between them. The encoding matches the antecedent protocol. "I need the bearing and signal strength. Do not contact anyone else." Lena felt a complex mixture of relief and irritation. The antecedent protocol was a term she recognized from the long-ago years of her marriage, when Emil's work had dominated their dinner conversations, and she had absorbed more about ancient human archaeology than any communications technician should reasonably know. The antecedent cultures were the precursors to known human civilization, the loose collection of societies and technological communities that had existed in the period before the consolidation, roughly 15 to 20,000 years before the present. They were poorly understood, their records fragmented and their achievements largely lost, but one thing that was known about them was that they had developed spaceflight. Not the crude orbital mechanics of humanity's earliest attempts, but genuine interstellar capability, powered by technologies that had never been fully reconstructed. The antecedent protocol was the communication standard that these ancient cultures had used, a base 12 encoded format that had been identified in a handful of archaeological finds but never in an active transmission, never in a signal that was still broadcasting. Lena sent Emil the bearing and signal strength data. He replied with a request for the raw signal recordings, which she transmitted. Then there was silence for 6 hours, during which Lena continued her shift and continued monitoring the signal and continued pretending that her hands weren't shaking. When Emil's next message arrived, it was longer than anything he had sent her in years, and it contained words that made the station feel smaller and the void outside feel larger. "This is a genuine antecedent distress signal." The encoding, the packet structure, and the navigational reference frame all confirm it. The bearing places the source in a region of space that antecedent archaeological models identify as the location of a settlement called the Outward Station, a deep space anchorage that was believed to have been abandoned approximately 15,000 years ago during the collapse. The signal is real, Lena. It is coming from a human ship that is 15,000 years old, and it is still calling for help. If you're finding this as gripping as I hoped, take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I really want to know what you think is waiting at the source of that signal, so drop your theories in the comments below. Now back to the story. Lena read the message 3 times. Then she stood up, walked to the station's small viewport and looked out at the stars. They were the same stars they had always been, cold and distant and indifferent, but something had changed in the way she perceived them. 15,000 years ago, someone had looked at these same stars from the deck of a ship that shouldn't have existed and had sent a message into the dark and had believed or at least hoped that someone would hear it. And now someone had. The question was what to do about it. Emil's next message addressed that question with the directness that had been both his most valuable and most infuriating quality during their marriage. "I am contacting Director Ashworth at the Confederation Bureau of Antiquities. She is the only person in a position to authorize an investigation who also has the security clearance to keep this quiet until we understand what we are dealing with. I have not shared the signal data with her yet. I am waiting for your confirmation before I proceed." Lena stared at the message. She understood why Emil was being cautious. A genuine antecedent signal, if confirmed, would be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history. It would also be the most valuable. The technology of the antecedent cultures was the stuff of legend and speculation, fragments of which had surfaced in black markets and private collections over the centuries, driving fortunes and fueling conflicts. If the existence of an actual antecedent vessel, potentially intact, became public knowledge before it could be secured, the resulting scramble would make every resource rush in human history look like a neighborhood dispute. But there was an other reason for caution that Emil hadn't mentioned, one that Lena suspected he was also thinking about. The distress signal was still broadcasting. If the ship was intact enough to maintain an automated transmission after 15,000 years, it might be intact enough to contain other things. Technology, information, knowledge that had been lost since before the consolidation, knowledge that could reshape human civilization, or knowledge that was dangerous, sealed away in a dead ship for good reason. The antecedent cultures had collapsed. All of them. Every settlement, every colony, every outpost had failed or been abandoned in a relatively narrow window of time roughly 15,000 years ago, and no one knew why. The collapse was the greatest mystery in human archaeology, the question that had driven Emil's entire career, and the fact that he had never found an answer had eaten at him in ways that their marriage had never survived. If this ship held clues to the collapse, those clues might not be the kind that anyone wanted to find. Lena sat back down at the console and typed her reply. Proceed, but I want to be included, I found it. She added the last sentence without thinking and then looked at it for a long time before she hit send. It was not a professional statement. It was a personal one, a claim of ownership that had no basis in protocol or policy, and she knew that Emil would recognize it for what it was. Not a request for inclusion in an archaeological investigation, a request to matter. Emil's reply came 8 minutes later. Of course, I will arrange for you to be attached to the expedition as the communications specialist. No one else has monitored this signal. Your expertise is essential. Lena knew it was a professional justification for a personal gesture, and she accepted it as such. And she did not examine her feelings about it too closely because the alternative was to examine why the words "your expertise is essential" made her eyes sting in the quiet of a relay station at the edge of nowhere. 3 days later, Director Theodora Ashworth arrived at Omega 9 in a Bureau of Antiquities fast courier, and Lena's life changed. Ashworth was a small woman in her 60s with white hair cut short and eyes that evaluated everything they looked at with the precision of a surgical instrument. She listened to Lena's account of the signal's discovery without interrupting, asked exactly 7 questions, each of which was more precise and revealing than the last, and then sat in Lena's chair and studied the signal data on the main console for 40 minutes without moving. When she finished, she looked at Lena and said, "You did the right thing, calling Soren instead of filing a routine report." Then she stood and began making arrangements. The expedition that Ashworth assembled over the following week was small by Confederation standards, but formidable by the standards of a relay station that had never hosted more than 2 people at a time. The survey vessel Renegade was a converted exploration ship with upgraded sensors, a reinforced hull, and a crew of 9. Ashworth herself, who commanded the expedition, Emil, who served as the lead archaeologist, Lena, who handled communications and signal analysis, a structural engineer named Thomas Kowalski who specialized in ancient construction materials, a medical officer named Dr. Priya Nair, 2 security personnel whose names Lena hadn't bothered to learn yet, and 3 ships' crew who ran the Renegade systems and stayed out of the way of the specialists. They departed Omega 9 on a Tuesday, and Lena watched the relay station shrink to a point of light behind them and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly, but the absence of the particular numbness that had become so constant she had stopped noticing it. She was going somewhere, she was doing something. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. The Renegade's FTL drive engaged, and the stars stretched into lines, and the corridor of echoes rushed toward them. The transit took 6 days. During that time, Lena worked with Emil to refine the signal's bearing and develop a more precise location estimate. They worked in the Renegade's small analysis lab side by side at adjacent consoles, and the proximity was strange after so many years of distance. Emil looked older than she remembered. His hair was almost entirely gray now, and there were new lines around his eyes that she didn't recognize. But his hands moved across the console with the same focused intensity that she remembered from the early years of their marriage, when he would stay up all night working on a translation, and she would bring him coffee and watch the dawn light change the color of his data screens. They didn't talk about personal things. They talked about the signal, about the antecedent protocol, about the navigational coordinates that Emil had partially decoded from the distress packet. The coordinates placed the source at a point in the corridor of echoes that was not near any known celestial object, which meant the ship was either in open space or orbiting something too small or too dark to have been catalogued. The outward station was a deep space anchorage, Emil said on the fourth day, pulling up a reconstruction of the antecedent settlement pattern that he had assembled from decades of archaeological research. It wasn't built around a star or a planet. It was built in the void, a self-sustaining habitat complex that served as a refueling and resupply point for antecedent vessels traveling between the core settlements and the frontier. Think of it as a lighthouse in the deep sea, a fixed point of reference in empty space. How big was it? Lena asked. We don't know. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary. We have references to it in communications logs from other antecedent sites, but no direct surveys. The best estimates suggest a complex of structures, perhaps a dozen major habitats and associated infrastructure serving a population of several thousand. And it was abandoned during the collapse. Everything was abandoned during the collapse. That's what defines the collapse. The entire antecedent civilization, every settlement, every colony, every outpost, all gone within a span of perhaps 200 years. The outward station was one of the last to go based on the dating of its final transmissions. Final transmissions, Emil looked at her. There are records of other signals from the outward station, fragmentary, heavily degraded but detectable by the deep space monitoring networks that were in operation at the time. The last confirmed transmission from the station was dated to approximately 15,200 years ago. After that, silence. Until now. Until you picked up this signal. Lena looked at the data on her screen. The signal, repeating its 47-second cycle, the same cry for help that had been echoing through the void since before human civilization had begun to rebuild itself from the ashes of the collapse. Emil, if the station was abandoned, why is a ship there still broadcasting? I don't know. It was the first time he had admitted that, and the honesty of it startled her more than any speculation could have. Emil Soren was a man who built theories the way other men built walls, carefully and comprehensively, with an answer for every question. Hearing him say I don't know was like hearing an architect admit he'd never seen a building before. But I intend to find out, he added, and the familiar intensity returned to his voice, and Lena felt something that might have been anticipation settle into the space where the numbness had been. The Renegade dropped out of FTL on the sixth day and the corridor of echoes filled the viewport. It was not impressive. That was the point. It was empty. A vast region of darkness so complete that the starfield thinned to a scattering of dim points, the nearest stars hundreds of light years away, their light too faint to illuminate anything. The Renegade's running lights were the only illumination for parsecs in any direction, and they cast a small, fragile circle of visibility around the ship that made Lena feel like a diver at the bottom of an ocean that had no surface. The signal was stronger here, much stronger, its source now within the Renegade's sensor range. The directional array locked onto it within minutes, and the bearing resolved to a point roughly 2 million kilometers ahead. There was nothing visible at that point. Nothing on standard sensors, nothing on the viewport, nothing but the same absolute darkness that filled the corridor in every direction. But the Renegade's deep scan array, a military-grade system that Ashworth had somehow obtained for the expedition, was picking up something at the signal's origin, a mass signature. Faint, diffuse, barely above the noise floor of the scanner, but present. Something was there. It was large. Mass estimate, Ashworth said from the command station. The ship's sensor officer, a young woman named Reeves, read the numbers from her display. Approximately 400 million metric tons. Configuration is, she paused, frowning at her screen. Irregular, elongated, approximately 3.2 kilometers in length by 800 meters at the widest point. The Renegade's bridge was very quiet. a mass of 400 million metric tons in a shape that was 3 kilometers long in a region of space where nothing should exist. "That's a ship," Kowalski said from the engineering station. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who was stating a fact that his mind was still processing. "That's a very large ship." Ashworth turned to Lena. "Can you get anything more from the signal at this range?" Lena was already working. The signal was strong enough now that she could analyze it in detail, and the detail was revealing things that the distant readings from Omega 9 had missed. The signal was not just a single message on a loop. It was a layered transmission, multiple data streams interleaved into the same carrier frequency. The primary stream was the distress call, the short dense packet that she had identified at Omega 9, but beneath it, running in parallel, were secondary streams. System status data as she had suspected, but also something else. A navigation beacon broadcasting the ship's position in real time. And a third stream that she couldn't identify, a dense, complex data flow that was unlike anything in her experience. "The signal has multiple layers," she said. "The distress call is the primary stream, but there are two secondary streams. One is a position beacon continuously updated. The other is, I don't know. It's data heavily compressed in an encoding format I haven't seen before, even in the antecedent protocol references." Emil moved to her console and looked at the data stream she had isolated. His face changed. It was a subtle change, a tightening around the eyes and a very slight parting of the lips, but Lena knew his expressions well enough to read it. He was seeing something that connected to something he already knew, something that had been sitting in the back of his mind waiting for a piece to fall into place. "It's a cultural archive," he said quietly. "The third stream is a compressed archive of cultural data. Art, music, literature, historical records, scientific knowledge. The antecedent civilizations used this format to preserve their cultural heritage during long-range transmissions. It's a time capsule, Lena. Whatever happened to this ship, they wanted to make sure that if anyone found it, they would also find everything the antecedents knew and everything they were." The bridge was silent again. A ship 3 kilometers long broadcasting a distress call in a cultural archive, alone in the void for 15,000 years. "Take us in," Ashworth said. The Renegade moved forward through the darkness, and the mass signature on the sensors grew more defined with each passing minute. The shape resolved slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, and what emerged from the darkness was not what any of them had expected. The ship was not intact. It had been damaged catastrophically at some point in its past. The forward third of the vessel was missing, sheared away as cleanly as if it had been cut by a blade, leaving a ragged cross-section that revealed deck after deck of internal structure exposed to vacuum. The remaining two-thirds of the hull was scarred and pitted, bearing the marks of impacts and energy discharges that had gouged the outer plating in places down to the structural framework. But the rear section, containing what appeared to be the engine block and the main hull superstructure, was largely intact, and it was from this section that the signal was broadcasting. The Renegade approached to within 500 meters and held position. Through the viewport, the ship was visible as a dark mass against the slightly less dark background of the void, its hull a matte black material that absorbed the Renegade's lights rather than reflecting them. It was enormous. Even damaged, even reduced to two-thirds of its original length, it dwarfed the Renegade the way a mountain dwarfs a tent. The scale of it was difficult to comprehend, not just the physical size but the implication of that size. A ship this large, built 15,000 years ago, represented an investment of resources and engineering capability that rivaled anything humanity had built since the consolidation. The antecedent civilizations had not been primitive. They had been something else entirely, something that had been lost so completely that even the scale of their achievement had been forgotten. "I'm reading an energy signature from the intact section," Reeves reported. "Low level but consistent. Something is still running on that ship." "The signal," Lena said. "Something is powering the transmitter." After 15,000 years, Kowalski's voice carried a skepticism that Lena shared but didn't express. "Power systems don't last that long." "Not any power system I know of. We don't know what kind of power system they had," Emil said. "The antecedents' energy technology is one of the biggest unknowns in the archaeological record. we have fragments of evidence that suggest they used methods we don't understand, methods that may not have relied on consumable fuel sources in any conventional sense. Ashworth made a decision. Kowalski, Nair, you're with me, we're going aboard. Soren Vasquez, you stay on the Renegade and monitor the signal. If anything changes, you contact us immediately. Lena opened her mouth to protest and then closed it. She was a communications technician, not an explorer. Her place was at a console, not on a damaged alien ship. But the protest had risen before she could stop it, and its existence told her something about herself that she wasn't ready to examine. Ashworth, Kowalski, and Nair suited up and transferred to the Renegade's shuttle. Lena watched on the external cameras as the small craft crossed the gap between the ships and approached the intact section of the hull. The shuttle's lights played across the dark surface, revealing details that the Renegade's sensors had missed. The hull was not smooth. It was covered in a fine texture, almost like skin, a pattern of ridges and valleys that gave the surface an organic quality that was deeply unsettling at this scale. There were markings visible in places, symbols etched into the hull plating in a script that Lena recognized from Emil's research as antecedent glyph form, the written language of the pre-consolidation cultures. The shuttle found an opening in the hull, a section where the external plating had been removed, revealing a bay that had once been a shuttle dock or cargo receiver. Ashworth guided the shuttle inside, and the external cameras lost sight of them as they passed through the opening and into the ship's interior. Lena turned to her console and focused on the signal. It was stronger now, strong enough that she could read the secondary data streams in real time. The system's status data was revealing. The ship's power system was running at approximately 2% of its estimated capacity, but it was stable, drawing energy from a source that the status data described in terms that Lena's translation software could only partially interpret. The words that came through were fragmentary: 0 point, vacuum energy, continuum resonance. Phrases that belonged to theoretical physics, not engineering readouts, and yet here they were, appearing in the status data of a ship that had been using them as practical power generation for 15 millennia. The cultural archive stream was even more remarkable. Even compressed, it was enormous, far too large to transmit in real time on the signal's carrier frequency. The ship wasn't broadcasting the entire archive continuously. It was cycling through it, transmitting fragments in a pattern that, when combined with the timing data embedded in the stream, would allow a receiver to reconstruct the complete archive given enough time. It was a slow, patient method of data transmission, designed to work over geological timescales, and it had been running for 15,000 years and had not yet completed a single full cycle of the archive. The antecedents who had programmed this system had thought in terms of epochs, not hours. They had built something to outlast civilizations, and it had. Lena was so absorbed in the data streams that she didn't notice Emil standing behind her until he spoke. "The distress call," he said. "Have you been able to decode any of it?" Lena shook her head. "The encoding is different from the secondary streams, more complex, more deliberate. It's not just data, Emil, it's language. Someone spoke these words, and the encoding was designed to preserve not just the information, but the nuance. The tone, the emphasis, the emotional content, it's not just a message, it's a recording of a person." Emil was quiet for a moment, then he pulled a chair up beside her and sat down. "Let me see what you have." They worked together for the next 3 hours while the away team explored the ship. The encoding was fiendishly complex, designed to be decoded by anyone with sufficient technical skill regardless of their linguistic background. A universal format that preserved semantic content even when the specific language was unknown. It was, Lena realized, a work of genius, a communication system designed to be understood by strangers across gaps of time and culture that the senders couldn't have predicted. And slowly, painstakingly, she and Emil began to crack it. The voice that emerged from the static was a woman's. The translation was imperfect, fragmented, the linguistic equivalent of a photograph seen through frosted glass, but the words came through and the meaning came with them. "This is the warship Resurgence. We have been attacked. Our navigation is disabled. Our forward sections are destroyed. We are drifting in the corridor with no means of propulsion. The enemy will return." We are transmitting our position and our archive in the hope that someone will find this signal and understand what happened here. If you are hearing this, know that we fought. Know that we did not run. Know that what is coming for you is not something you can negotiate with or hide from. It is a darkness that consumes the complexity of thought itself, and it is spreading, and we could not stop it. We could only delay it. The Resurgence is the last ship. There are no others. Everything we were and everything we knew is in the archive that accompanies this signal. Use it, prepare, and know that we are sorry we could not do more. This is Commander Yara Solenne. We held the line. The message E. Ended, the signal resumed its cycle, 47 seconds, the same words encoded in the same ancient format, repeating endlessly in the dark. Lena sat very still. Beside her, Emil had gone pale, a pallor that was visible even on his brown skin, and his hands were flat on the console as if he needed its solidity to keep himself upright. "The collapse," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "She's describing the collapse." Lena looked at him. In all the years of their marriage, she had never seen Emil Soren look frightened. She had seen him frustrated, angry, obsessed, driven to the edge of exhaustion by the puzzle of the collapse, but she had never seen him afraid. She was seeing it now. Emil, 15 years of my career, Lena, 15 years trying to understand why the antecedent civilizations fell. Every theory, every hypothesis, every model, none of them fit the evidence. The collapse was too sudden, too complete, too total. Entire civilizations gone, not destroyed, gone, no ruins, no survivors, no trace, just empty space where settlements had been, and now we know why. Something came for them, something that consumed thought itself, and this ship was the last one fighting it. Ashworth's voice came over the comm, startling them both. "Vasquez, Soren, we need you to see this." The away team had found the bridge. Lena and Emil suited up and crossed to the antecedent ship in the shuttle, and what they found on the bridge changed everything. The bridge was a large circular chamber at the top of the ship's intact section, and it was not dead. The same sourceless illumination that Lena had noted in the status data filled the space with a soft, warm light that had been maintaining itself for 15,000 years. The consoles were active, their surfaces displaying data in the antecedent glyph form that Emil could read with a fluency that Lena had never fully appreciated. The chairs at the stations were occupied, not by living people, by remains, seated at their stations in their positions, preserved by the same environmental systems that were keeping the lights on and the signal broadcasting. 18 individuals, human, in uniforms that bore insignia that Emil identified as belonging to the antecedent military force known in the archaeological record as the Vigil. They had died at their posts, not from the attack that had destroyed the ship's forward section, from something slower. The medical officer, Nair, was examining the remains with a scanner that she'd brought from the Renegade, and her expression was the kind of controlled neutral that meant she was seeing something disturbing. "No trauma," she reported. "No signs of violence or injury. Cause of death appears to be cessation. Their neural activity simply stopped, all of them at roughly the same time based on the state of preservation. It's as if they just turned off." "The darkness that consumes the complexity of thought," Emil murmured. Commander Solenne's message, it wasn't a metaphor. Ashworth was at the command station, the central chair where the largest concentration of remains sat, the commander's chair. The remains there were different from the others. They were not simply seated. One hand rested on the console's interface surface, fingers touching a control that even after 15,000 years was still active. And on the console's display, visible above the glyph form data, was a single line of text that had been manually entered, not part of any automated system. The text was in a dialect that Emil had to work to translate, but when he did, the words were simple and devastating. "I am the last, the others are gone, I am holding the line, I will hold it as long as I can." Lena looked at the remains in the commander's chair. A woman who had sat at this station after her crew had died around her, who had manually entered those words into her console, who had then died herself alone in the dark on a damaged ship in the void. And the signal had kept broadcasting, the archive had kept transmitting, the power systems had kept running. Because Commander Yara Solenne had set them to run before she died, had programmed them to keep calling for help and keep sending the knowledge of her people into the dark. And they had done exactly that faithfully and without interruption for 15,000 years. Lena felt tears on her face and didn't wipe them away. Emil was standing at one of the other stations, his hands moving across the console with a reverence that was almost religious, accessing data that he had spent his entire career trying to find. The archive, he said, his voice thick. The full archive is stored in the ship's memory systems, not just the compressed version in the signal. Everything, Lena, everything the antecedents knew. Their science, their art, their history, and the records of the war, what they were fighting, what the darkness is. If it's all here, can we access it? Ashworth asked. I can D the interfaces. It will take time, but yes, we can access all of it. Ashworth looked at the remains on the bridge, at the 18 people who had died at their stations, and then at the viewport, which showed the same infinite darkness that had surrounded this ship for 15 millennia. Then we take it home, she said, all of it. The data transfer took 11 days. Emil and Lena worked in shifts, with Emil handling the translation of the antecedent interfaces, and Lena managing the data flow to the Renegade's storage systems. The archive was enormous, far larger than the compressed version in the signal, and it contained not just the cultural data that the signal's third stream had hinted at, but the complete operational records of the Resurgence, including detailed logs of the war against the darkness. Lena read those logs as they transferred, and the picture they painted was one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The darkness had no name. The antecedents had called it the Diminishment, and the name was precise. It was not an enemy in any conventional sense. It did not destroy, it diminished. It reduced the complexity of any system it touched, biological or technological, eroding the patterns of thought and organization that allowed complex systems to function. A person exposed to the diminishment didn't die. They became simpler, less capable, less aware. They lost the ability to think abstractly, to plan, to create, and eventually to sustain the basic cognitive functions that define them as sentient beings. They became, in the log's clinical language, functionally quiescent, alive but absent. The Resurgence had been built to fight it. Not with weapons that destroyed, but with technologies that protected, that reinforced the complexity of thought and structure against the diminishment's erosion. The ship had carried devices that could shield entire settlements, that could push back the diminishment's influence and restore diminished minds to full function. It had been the last of a fleet of such vessels, and it had been sent to the outward station to hold the line while the antecedent civilizations evacuated their core settlements and retreated to positions beyond the diminishment's reach. The evacuation had failed. The diminishment had moved faster than anticipated, and the other shield ships had fallen one by one, overwhelmed not by force, but by the sheer scale of the phenomenon they were trying to contain. The Resurgence had been the last, and it had held the line at the outward station for 7 years alone, while the diminishment consumed the antecedent civilizations behind it. Then the diminishment had come for the ship itself. The forward sections had been destroyed in the final attack, and the ship had been left drifting, its shield systems damaged, its crew exposed. Commander Solenne had watched her people diminish one by one, had recorded their decline in the ship's logs with the clinical precision of a military officer, and had kept the signal broadcasting even as she felt the diminishment reaching for her own mind. The last log entry, dated 17 hours after the deaths of the rest of the crew, was a single line. It is here. I can feel it. I will not let it take the archive. The signal will hold. And it had. The signal had held for 15,000 years. Because Yara Solenne, in the last hours of her life, had configured the ship's systems to operate independently of any conscious control, had turned the archive and the distress call into automated processes that could not be affected by the diminishment because they were not thinking. They were simply running mechanical processes that required no complexity of thought to maintain, and the diminishment had no purchase on them. The shield that protected the ship's power systems, damaged as they were, had been just strong enough to keep the automation running, and the automation had done exactly what Solenne had programmed it to do. Broadcast, transmit, wait. On the 11th day, the transfer was complete. The Renegade's storage was filled to capacity with the accumulated knowledge of the antecedent civilizations, including the complete technical specifications of the shield technology that the Resurgence had carried. The technology that could push back the diminishment, the technology that the antecedents had died trying to deploy. Lena stood on the bridge of the Resurgence for the last time, looking at the remains in the command chair. Yara Solenne had been a woman once, a woman with a voice and a face and a life that had led her to this chair, this moment, this choice. She had held the line, and now someone had answered. "Commander," Lena said quietly to the remains, to the dark, to whatever was left of a woman who had been dead for 15,000 years. "We got your message." She placed her hand on the console beside the manually entered text, the last words of a woman who had refused to let the dark win. The cons. All was warm. The power systems that Solenne had set in motion were still running, still maintaining the signal, still holding the line, and now they didn't have to do it alone. The renegade departed the corridor of echoes with the knowledge that could save human civilization from a threat it didn't know existed. The signal continued to broadcast behind them, a beacon in the void, a cry for help that had finally been heard. Ashworth would take the data to the Confederation Council. Emil would lead the research team that would translate and interpret the antecedent shield technology. Scientists and engineers across a dozen species would work to develop countermeasures against a phenomenon that had nearly destroyed human civilization once, and was, according to the Resurgence's logs, still out there, still spreading, still dimming the complexity of thought in the spaces between the stars. And Lena would go back to Omega 9. She had requested it specifically, and Ashworth had approved the request without question, understanding something that Lena was only beginning to understand herself. The signal was still broadcasting, the Resurgence was still holding the line, and someone needed to be listening. Lena returned to her station 14 days after she had left it. The chair had not moved, the coffee was cold, the void outside the viewport was the same. But Lena sat down and she turned on the monitoring system, and she listened to the signal from the corridor of echoes repeating its 47-second cycle, and she did not feel numb. She felt present, she felt useful. She felt like a woman who had found something that mattered in the most unlikely place imaginable, a voice from the deep past calling out across 15,000 years of darkness, and she had answered. Not because she was brave or brilliant or special. Because she had been sitting in a chair at 3 in the morning and she had been curious and she had not dismissed the signal. That was all, curiosity and a reluctance to go to bed. And those two small, human things had bridged a gap of 15,000 years and connected a dead woman's last act of defiance to a living civilization that now had a chance to survive what had almost destroyed its ancestors. The signal pulsed. Lena listened. And in the darkness of the corridor of echoes, the Resurgence held the line, no longer alone.